Dr. Jazz.
But cool. Thanks, man, for postponing.
No worries. It's okay. All good.
My voice is still a bit like, yeah, but okay. At least I can talk. Last week I was gone for,
Okay. Well, that happens.
yeah,
Sick while you were on tour?
yeah. I was gigging quite a lot in May, and
Yeah, I saw a little bit of the video with Arlen Anderson.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Beautiful. I mean, I love those guys. There's Ariel
Yeah.
is amazing. He's such a player. It's like,
Yeah, I actually, when John Abercrombie was still alive, we talked about doing a record together with my brother and Arlen, and we would have called it Abercrombie Becker Anderson. So it would have been like ABBA. But sadly, John passed away, so that idea sort of went out the window. But
Did you know John well since you mentioned him?
Yeah, I knew John many years, and we actually worked together on the Attila Zoller tribute
Yeah,
project.
I know that one. Yeah.
And I met him a long time ago when I was just after I was a student at GIT in LA. And then I would see him occasionally over the years. And then as I got more into performing and touring, our paths crossed a couple of times. And then we met in Germany the first time to play, I think in the early 90s, I think it was. And we played together in Cologne or somewhere. I
Oh,
forget
really?
where.
How beautiful.
And so it was nice. We, immediately, I mean, I knew I had a connection to him because it was a big influence, but the whole thing about playing with somebody, like when I played with Larry Coryell, I learned a lot about who he was as a musician, and we had a lot in common. So same thing with John. And
Yeah.
that's why when I did the Attila project, I called him right away. So,
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, he's still, I think, one of the most underrated
Oh, absolutely.
guitarists. I
Yeah,
mean, it's
very funny man. I mean,
yeah,
just
yeah.
a lot of funny stories I could tell about John. So.
Now, beautiful guitar. I mean, such a nice composer as well. The Gateway stuff and everything. What he
Yeah,
did.
his compositions are totally underrated. And the
Yeah.
duo stuff that he did with Ralph Towner, I think, is probably some of the best duo recordings of the 20th century. I mean,
Yeah.
those guys went into another sphere. And I saw them. They came to GIT when I was just a student there and played in a duo. And I was like, man, this is incredible.
Yeah.
And they just had a natural thing, coming from two different places. But I guess their commonality was Bill Evans.
Yeah,
Because
definitely.
Bill Evans fans. So
Yeah. But that one, the solo one, he did characters.
yeah, sure. Yeah,
That's
yeah.
so beautiful.
I bought that when I was a kid. My brother bought his first record. It's a funny story because my brother studied with Freddie Gruber, the great drum teacher. And, I think he was probably like 17 or 18, and he was kind of going, I want to play with my brother and stuff. And it's like 1978. And so Freddie dropped the needle on Timeless, on that tune Lungs, the Fernando by Jan Hammer, and said, you think these guys are trying to make money? And so years later, we were doing a festival, the David Becker Tribune in Latvia, and John was on the festival with his trio with Gary Versace and Adam Nussbaum.
Adam, yeah.
So we know all the guys, and they'd come in from Italy or something, and they were completely fried. And John is sitting on the couch looking like this, and my brother's telling him the story, and without wincing, John just looked up and said, well, as a matter of fact, we were trying to make money. So it was like, it was funny. So anyway.
Beautiful. No, I mentioned characters because you sent me like one sneak preview of the new one you're working on, Gravitationally Bound, and it kind of reminded me like more like of New Chautauqua, the Matini thing, or like when does the new one come out, and what's the story behind it?
So the new one's coming out in August, and it's all the music from my project Planets that I do live with. That's the thing with Space Channel. And so, I have specific things that I did for the original Space Channel show that we did on TV, which were all improvised. All those pieces that I did were on the fly. So I was in an empty theater in Brownsville, Texas, and so the director said Mars, and I just started playing something. And these have become pieces that, they're still improvised. There's a sketch to it, but it can kind of go wherever it wants to go because I'm building with loops and, using the EBow and all this stuff. And so I wanted to, since I've been doing it live, I wanted to record those specific tunes. And we had done a concert last year in Springfield, Illinois, where I live now, at the Performing Arts Center. And I recorded all the music on a separate track. But the audio wasn't great. And then my friend Ken Calais, who I worked with many, many years ago on Siberian Express and Third Time Around, and we've crossed paths many times. Ken's the producer, Fleetwood Mac, and he just mixed Joni Mitchell's Court and Spark in surround sound. So he built a new studio, and he called me like just before I went to New Zealand and said, "Hey, David, when you come out to LA next time, come to the new studio and let's make some music." And I was like, "So what do you want to do?" Because I want you to record something in Atmos, in surround sound. And so I just came up there and planned to do one piece from Planets. And I did, I think, Saturn. And then I met his partner, whose husband is an astrophysicist. And so I told her about the Planets project, and they got all excited. And they said, "Well, can we do a whole album?" And I said, "Sure, I own all the music." So we actually planned to, when I got back from New Zealand, I was home a week. I flew back to LA and I recorded 9 tracks.
Beautiful. But
when I was in New Zealand, I told my wife, Lori, I said, I need to write a title track for the record that's independent of those specific things. And this thing was in my head. It was kind of like just one chord.
Yeah.
Static chord, and then all these chords kind of moving around it. And that's what became Gravitationally Bound. Beautiful. So it has that feel because it's kind of strumming and it's, kind of that straight feel. But I wanted to be able to implement that. And it came out nice. I played a little bass.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah.
That's the title track. So that's going to come out as a single for the radio here in America. And we've got a guy that's going to work it, see what happens with it. But the record will be out in all formats. It's going to come out in surround sound, the Atmos mix, probably CD or we're debating whether we do an actual disc that has the videos in it and the surround sound. That's an option. And you can also listen to it like a CD. And we want to maybe do vinyl in the stereo mix. So it's just, we're kind of talking about all the different options. So that's happening.
Big project. Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah, I'll have to send you some more of the rough mixes.
Oh, please. I'd love to hear it. Yeah.
There's a tune, Mars, that I did, and I used a vocalist to do some really interesting voice things on it because it's the female planet, and it just kind of worked out that way. So it's very cool.
Fantastic. I wanted to ask you, like, how do you write usually? On guitar or like?
Everything is different. Yeah, right? I mean, the early days I wrote on guitar, and then in about the mid 80s, I hooked up with Apple computers because they were doing, music. And through Bose speakers, I got a deal with Apple as an endorsee. So they got me a Mac Plus, which was like 20 megabytes of storage space. But it had all the, Mark of the Unicorn software. And so I started to compose from the keyboard more because we were using some sequencing on the records and some live. And it just was the nature of how things were at the time. And now it's a combination. I mean, I sit at the guitar and usually come up with an idea, or sometimes, like in the case of Gravitationally Bound, it was just in my head. Yeah. And so I went, okay, I need to figure out where this is on the instrument. Sometimes it's improvisation. I'll just improvise something and record it. And then, like in the case of most of the music now for the new record, all that stuff was improvised on the fly. So it's interesting because the things I did, were kind of like, wow, I started something and then I had to add something to it. And then it was like, so where do you go from here? And you're composing, you're improvising in step time. Yeah. That's a thing that I heard from Lyle Mays. And I have a lot of respect for that aspect of it because you're improvising, figuring out what works, what doesn't work. And you can, change as you go. But, it also requires that you think about arrangement. And so when I recorded the new stuff, I had to think about, well, how many times is this going to do this? Because when it's live, it's different because it's not exactly like the record, which I don't want it to be. There are other things like the tune Batavia, which is the title track of that record. That was a difficult piece because I was thinking about my mom's family and being in World War II, and that melody came out. And then I had this arrangement in my head And I remember recording it with Russell Ferrante on piano and my brother on drums, and we had no bass player. It was just the three of us. And it's an 8.5 minute song, you know, and so we did 1 or 2 takes, and I told both of them, I said, man, it sounds great, but it's too nice, you know, because it has to go like this.
Yeah.
And it has to really be dynamic. And Russell's like, I'll stay here all day if I have to. So we did like 3 takes. I think the 4th take is the one on the record. And it is what it's supposed to be. That, you know, especially the solo and the whole thing, the dynamics. So that was a difficult one because it's got a lot of changes in the arrangement. And I actually wrote a 50-piece orchestra arrangement for those pieces of Batavia because I was scheduled to do with the Metropole Orchestra in 2020, but then the pandemic hit and that all fell apart. But I still have it, so maybe at some point I'll be able to go with an orchestra and do that. So
That'd be beautiful, yeah. Interesting. Yeah. It's not, I love composing. It's like you said, it's you have time, you know, when you're improvising, it's on the spot. It's like your brain has to be like this.
exactly. Yeah, and it's funny because I did an album with Joe Diorio, you know, in 2000.
Yeah, and that's beautiful. Yeah, I want to ask. I'll ask you about Joe later. So,
but when I did that record, I was doing a record simultaneous called Euroland, which was a record where I just did it myself with a lot of loops and layered stuff. And actually, some of the improvisation that I did with Joe Diorio wound up as ideas for Euroland. And it's interesting how that sort of happens because when you're spontaneously sitting in a studio playing, you're improvising, there's a lot of things that happen in your head where you go like, wow, that's a cool idea. I'd like to expand on that more after the fact, you know. So that was one instance of that.
Interesting. Yeah. You mentioned Timeless before and Abercrombie. Did you then go, after hearing Timeless, back to discovering all the, you know, Wes and Kenny? Like, what was your path into jazz? I mean, your story.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because I grew up in a musical family. My 2 older brothers play. My oldest brother played classical piano. And my mom's family, she's Dutch and her mother was German. So they all played classical piano. She played by ear, but there was classical records around the house. And one of my favorite pieces of music that I remember vividly as a kid, I was about 4 or 5, was Edvard Grieg's Piano Concerto in A minor. And I used to sit in front of the stereo and conduct with a little tinker toy, you know, a little stick. And then I wanted to play drums. Every Christmas, I got a little drum under the Christmas tree, and I could sort of play, you know. And then maybe I was about 9, and I took some drum lessons at the school, but I didn't have the discipline to learn the rudiments. And so somehow I ended up playing trumpet, and my brother played drums. But I had a really good education at the junior high school level, which would have been 12 to 14, with a guy, Ted Dechter, who was not only a great teacher, but he was a great musician. He played with Stan Kenton, and he played with Harry James, and he knew people like Charlie Mariano, and he knew Jigs Wiggum because those guys were in the Kenton band and they went over to Europe. And he used to talk about them, and he talked about Miles Davis and Charlie Parker, and we were just little kids. And he instilled in us not only that, you know, to be a good musician, but to be the sum of the parts, meaning that your part is important. If that glockenspiel part in bar 47 is missing, then it's not the whole piece. And I learned a lot about that, which I didn't realize until later how important that was. And he had a great program that he would have guys come back and play in his jazz band that were like professionals or high school guys or college guys. And he called me once to play. When I was in high school, I played guitar. I started playing guitar then. And he said, you know, he said to me outright, he said, David, when I heard you quit the trumpet, I was really disappointed. But then I heard you play the guitar and I knew why. And that was the best compliment I could have ever gotten. So, and his son is an arranger, and his grandson is Graham Dechter, who's a jazz guitar player. He plays with the Clayton Hamilton Orchestra. He played with Michael Bublé for a minute, and he's done his own records. So he had like this, you know, big network of musicians that could bring arrangements in to us as little kids. So it was really good for us. So at that point, I was exposed to like big band music, you know, Louis Bellson, Buddy Rich, you know, I had a record of Dizzy Gillespie's with Joe Pass. And then, you know, when I played guitar, I wasn't really sure what, you know, I started playing rock and roll a little bit, and I wasn't sure what jazz guitar players did until I heard Grant Green on the radio.
Yeah.
And I went, that's what I want to do. And so I got rid of my Les Paul and I got a 175. I was about 16 or 17. And then, of course, I needed to know, I had the Abercrombie record was there, and I had a record by Joe Farrell, Moon Germs.
Yeah, that's a beautiful one. Yeah.
I love that record. And then we had, Return to Forever and Stanley Clarke and all that stuff that was going on. Weather Report. I got to see Weather Report with Jocko. So I didn't really have a specific identity guitar-wise. I knew about all these different things. And then I started to discover Wes Montgomery. But when I got into GIT, I met Joe Diorio. And that was a great conduit because Joe was a guy who he knew Wes. He was good friends with Wes. And, he'd played with Sonny Stitt and he played with, Eddie Harris. And so he was the guy that could lead me into that older generation, but he also knew the younger guys like Pat Metheny and John Abercrombie. So I had this thing like, okay, I could, check this guy out because Metheny at that point was fairly new on the scene.
Yeah.
That popular, but I saw his band. I saw the Pat Metheny group with Mark Egan.
Yeah.
Who I know really well. And, that was like, wow, that's pretty cool. And it wasn't so much Pat's guitar playing, it was more the music and the arrangements of the band that pulled me in. But I knew that Wes was an important guy. So probably around the time I was about 18, I was listening to, Wes, Joe. I'd go see Joe play everywhere and record it. And then I listened to a lot of John Coltrane and Miles Davis. And then Art Blakey. And we were lucky too, my brother and I, because we had a guy across the street who was the neighborhood guitar player who was into Hendrix, but he was also into Coltrane. And he had the huge record collection. Like you'd go to his house and you'd go like, oh man, you like this? Check this out. And he would play
yeah, I love that. Yeah.
obscure stuff. And he would have Jack Wilkins records that I had no idea. And he'd play me Kenny Burrell, and he would play me, like this obscure record by whoever. And so that was really enlightening because aside from the education I had from my teacher at school, I had my neighbor who had every record imaginable. He even gave me the copy of Moon Germs. He goes, I bought this. I didn't really like it, but maybe you'll like it.
Interesting.
That was really cool. And he's an interesting guy because he still plays guitar. And he's a fan. I did a concert out in LA recently with Brad Rebuchin, and he came out to see us. So that's always nice to see guys that who were instrumental in introducing you to very important music.
What did you learn from Joe? I mean, like, and your story with Joe. I mean, I know The Color of Sound, and
yeah, I mean, Joe is such an important person. There's many layers, and I'll break it down this way. So when I got into GIT, I'd only been playing guitar seriously for a couple of years, and I was the youngest guy at the school because at the time, most of the guys had gone to Berkeley or North Texas State or Miami and come to do like a year at LA where they could meet people and, hang with guys like Joe Diorio or Les Wise or Ron Eshte or whoever. There were no drummers. We only had bass players and guitar players. And in my class, the time I went, Scott Henderson came, Frank Caballo around that time, Steve Lynch, the rock guy, who also was a big Joe Diorio fan.
Wow, I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, in fact, in his famous solo in the song Turn Up the Radio, he does a Joe lick out of Intervallic Designs, and he told me that. And he's like, man,
that's beautiful, man.
Hear it. Like, there's at some point, Steve and I are going to do a podcast and talk about Joe. And Jennifer Batten had just graduated, so it was a fruitful time. And I was just this kid, who had wanted to go to Berkeley, but somebody talked me out of it, and I'm glad that I did. So I was the first week that I was there, first couple of weeks. I had Ron Eshte, who I love Ronnie, and one of the greatest guitar players, plays beautiful chord melody, knows every tune in the book. But the way he was teaching, I was more an ear player. Even though I could read from the trumpet, I could hear stuff and play. I didn't know what it was. He was talking scales, and I was lost. And I just thought, man, this is difficult. So Joe Diorio did this seminar, and he talked about Wes Montgomery. And he said, Wes was a good friend of mine, and he said, I used to ask Wes, hey, Wes, what are you thinking about when you play over a D minor or whatever? And Wes is like, no, man, I'm thinking sounds, colors. And I went, Mr. Diorio, that's how I play. I can't relate to this. He said, you come to my office. That's what he did. And the funny thing is the first thing he said to me before that, I was walking through the hallways And there was like this little table where they had like the student store. They would sell supplies. And he's sitting down and he's drinking a juice. And he looks at me over his glasses. And he's got that one eye that kind of looks off to the side. He goes, how old are you? And I said, and at that time, I looked like I was like 15 because, you know, I looked young. And I said, well, how old do I look? And he goes, well, I don't know, 17, 18. I go, yeah, that's about right. And so the record, we did 2 improvised pieces and I used those titles for that. So it's a little anecdote. Anyway, so I came in and I started to play for Joe. And he said, David, he said, you keep doing that. He said, don't listen to the other guys. He said, you just do what you do. So for us, the entire year that I was there, I never had a formal lesson where Joe said, you know, here's this. He played a chord melody for Stella by Starlight. And I watched him and I got some of what he was doing. And that's all he gave me. And then I bought his book, Intervallic Designs.
Yeah.
The entire time I would just hang with him, watch him play. I'd record him at his gigs or I would play with him, you know, as best I could. And that's really what it was. And as years went on and I developed with the band and started to get records and tour, I would always go back and hang and play. And I wanted to record with him on my second record. But we ran out of, you know, the budget went over and it was a big label, MCA. And I had to call him and say, Joe, it's not going to happen. And I remember Joe saying, he said, David, don't worry about it. He said, you know, if it's meant to be, it's meant to be. And years later, we did a tour together of Europe where I took Joe to England and we went
really? How beautiful.
Yeah, all over Germany. And it was supported by USC because he was teaching at the school. And we did several concerts and workshops. And just after that, I remember I was talking to Peter Finger from Acoustic Music Records, and he goes, is there anybody that you would like to record with? And I said, yeah, I'd love to do an album with Joe. And Peter said, sure. And so he gave me the budget, and I called up Joe. We made the Color of Sound. And that's the last recording Joe did before his stroke.
Yeah.
So, you know, and luckily, I got a chance to hang with Joe just before he passed away. During the pandemic, I called him up every day and I recorded our conversations. And we talked, and Alex Skolnick, I don't know if you know Alex.
Yeah, sure.
Alex did a podcast about it after Joe passed, and we were talking.
Wow.
So, in fact, Alex said, "Yeah, man, I took a lick out of Intervallic Designs, and I did it on some solo in you know, in one of his
Testament or whatever."
Yeah. So,
yeah.
But Alex, I know because we played together in Freiburg. We played, you know, played jazz. It was like
really. Oh wow.
Hey, he's a good player.
Yeah, he's a good player.
Yeah. Talked about doing a record together, but you know, it's just that there's so many guys that I'd like to do stuff with that. It's hopefully I'm gonna actually do something with Paul Wertico.
Really? Yeah. Oh yeah. You said so. Like a duo or?
Yeah. So that'll be fun.
Fantastic. Yeah, Paul is amazing, man. I mean, he's obviously one of the best. Yeah. Looking forward to that as well.
Yeah, in a nutshell, Joe was my mentor. He was my best friend. He was like a father figure. Many things. And he said to me once before he passed away, I was at his house, and I'll never forget this, man. He said, David, he goes, I've never had a friend like you, and I just wanted you to know how much I appreciate that.
That's beautiful, yeah.
Yeah, I still get teary-eyed when I think about it because, man, Joe had so much. And I remember talking to Abercrombie about Joe. There's a record, Solo Guitar, that was unbelievable album. I mean, it's not well recorded, and I was a little disappointed when it came out on CD because the guy that reissued it, I wished I had the chance to go in and EQ it a little differently to help the sonics of it. But man, the playing on that record is miles above anybody of that generation. I mean, it's unbelievable. And because Joe, you know, when Wes passed away, he started looking towards Ravi Shankar, and he was like, "That, and what are you going to do, Wes Montgomery? That was the epitome. Am I going to try to sound like Wes or Kenny Burrell, or I'm going to try to find a new zone?" And he went to Florida and started to become the Joe Diorio that we all know. And you know, he played with Ira Sullivan and Jocko, and that band with Steve Bagby. And it's a funny story I have because one of my students a few years ago was Chuck Lorre. He's the producer of 2.5 Men and Big Bang Theory. He's a guitar player.
Not really. I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, I met him through Norm at Norm's Rare Guitars, and he studied with me for about 1.5 years. But he was in Miami at that time as a musician. And it was so funny because he got called by this guy that was running the program at Miami University, who was he hired Joe Diorio and Stan Simoli. Mark Egan knows him. And Stan called up Chuck and said, "Hey, Chuck, man, come down to the school because, we've got a bunch of guitar players. We have guitar majors now, and you should hang out, and you're a great guitar player." So he went in there, and he said he was sitting in the back of the room, and this little kid comes in with a big L5 and starts playing like All the Things You Are. And his jaw drops to the floor. It was Pat Metheny.
Yeah.
He looked like he was 16, And so then he realized that was the time that he needed to do something else. And so years and years later, I took him to a Pat Metheny concert, and I was going to introduce him, but he had to leave. So Pat made a nice little video for Chuck, which I still have. I may post it at some point.
Beautiful.
Which was kind of cool. So
yeah, Joe was important for Pat as well. I mean, I've read an interview somewhere.
Yeah,
Pat was really like saying how important Joe was, obviously.
Yeah, all of Bright Side's life is Joe Diorio. I mean,
a lot of it, yeah.
Because it's funny, Joe used to tell me that, when he was at school, because he came as a student and he got a scholarship, but he didn't do well scholastically, so they were going to kick him out and say, if you want to stay on, we need more teachers. Like, he was a student teacher because he had experience playing. So he got to hang for a year, but I think he had sights to go do other things. And then, of course, he met Gary Burton, and then his life changed.
Yeah.
Joe said, like, Pat wasn't as developed, but you could hear that he was going in this direction. And then, like, a year after he left, he came down, and Joe said, "Yeah, then I heard him," and that was the Pat Metheny that we all know.
Yeah, it's funny if you hear the early stuff of Pat's, with Gary and Mick, and it's like it's there, the Pat sound for later years, but it's like you see it's like still like
he's still working on it.
Beautiful to hear that. I mean, it's so nice.
Where I hear the development, it's funny too, because he told me that he recorded Bright Side's Life the day after he did Dream So Real, which is the record. Yeah. And there's a solo. There's one solo on Dream So Real where Pat plays his sixth string, and he sounds more. How do I say this? He sounds more experimental and advanced than on Bright Side's Life, if that makes sense. I mean, he played
sure. Yeah.
Life. I don't think he played the way that he wanted to play. It's a great record, but you can hear in the Gary Burton record, he's going for stuff that maybe he didn't go for on Bright Side's Life because it wasn't his record.
Yeah.
And it's just, but he sounds like, if you listen to the two recordings, even though they're done a day apart, they sound like they're months apart. Anyway, I haven't heard it in years, but that was my initial impression. And I was surprised. I was, wow, that's interesting. I didn't know that. But, the other guy that's important for Pat was Attila.
Yeah.
Because when he was a kid, he won a scholarship to some downbeat camp in Illinois. He was about 14. And Attila saw that he was a talented kid and said, "You need to come to New York and hang with me." So his parents drove to New York, and they hung with Attila for like a week. And Attila took him to see Ron Carter and Jim Hall a whole week. It's like, and what better, could you get from somebody than like going like, "Here, kid, this is what it is,"
Yeah.
So, and a lot of people don't know that. I mean, because he never had a formal teacher.
Yeah.
Maybe some guy in his town who showed him a few things. But the two guys that I would say, or the three guys, is Joe Diorio, Attila Zoller. Well, Attila first.
And Mick, probably. So, yeah.
Because, Mick was the father figure in the band. And if you listen to Mick, you had to follow that every night. I mean, that's like serious,
That's heavy stuff, yeah.
But you could see that, Pat's an interesting guy because, a lot of people are afforded gigs like that, but they don't really excel the way you would think they would. But in his case, I think he really, really took it seriously. It was like going to school, because it wasn't like, "Oh, kid, go and play." No, Gary was very specific about, do this, don't do this. And you could see that he's always really watching Gary.
Yeah.
With an idea of like, okay, so this is how it functions. And not only just the music, but also the organization of how you get a band on the road and how you do this, how you gig. And, that's something that a lot of people don't really do because they're so worried about playing the right notes that they're not paying attention to the other
the rest. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. How did you enter that world? I mean, I know you started playing and touring with
Well,
the Tribune, like, but how did you, enter the business or enter the touring world? Like, how did that
yeah,
begin for you?
it's a funny story. I was just talking, I have a student in Vietnam who I was just telling a little bit about it. I made a decision when I was 18 that I wanted to play in a trio with my brother on drums and make records and tour. I wanted to be like I'd get a name as a jazz guitar player. That was my goal. And when I did the audition for GIT, I did it with Pat Hicks, who was the owner. And I remember him asking me, "What do you want to do, kid? What's your goal?" And I just looked at him. I said, "I want to be a named jazz guitar player. I want to make records, and I want to tour the world with my brother playing drums." And he looked at me and he said, "Well, now don't let this go to your head, but I think you're going to make it." And I said, no, I have a lot of work to do. And I just somehow I knew that. I had no idea. I just had it in my head. And as I met Joe always encouraged me. He said, "David, go for the music." So one of the things that I focused on at GIT is, of course, I played standards, but I wrote music every week.
Okay.
They had like an ensemble class where you could play. And they had a house drummer. They had two drummers, actually. They had a jazz drummer and a kind of a rock guy. And I'd bring in these arrangements of my own pieces of music, and I'd record them because I had a 4-track so I could listen to them. And that was kind of like, okay. And then as I was graduating, I thought, I don't want to stay in LA. I want to go to Europe because that's where a lot of the musicians that I admire record. So I'm going to go over there. And because my mom was Dutch and my dad worked for the airlines, I could fly over there fairly reasonably. And I used to take little demo tapes, and I went to ECM and Enja Records and EMI and all these places. I was like 19, and hey, I got this tape, and I'd recorded. I had a 4-track that I bought when I was 16, so I knew about recording, and it sounded good. I mean, there was an EMI guy who said, "I like this. I'd like to record you," and I was like, "Oh, I didn't know what that meant." And he's like, "How much money do you need to make a record?" I'm like, "I don't know." So in any case. That didn't happen, but I got a lot of encouragement from the guy from ECM, Hans Wendel, and the guys at Enja Records. And they kept telling me, "You got to come over and bring your band." So simultaneously, the David Becker Tribune started to have a regular steady gig in LA at a club owned by a German. We played every month, sometimes twice a month. And we really honed our composition and improvisational skills. And then he said, we're going to take this on the road. Well, simultaneously, I was working with Chris Martin from Martin Guitars, doing demos at workshops that he would do around the world. And he didn't want me to play bluegrass, which I don't play. I just improvised and did this weird stuff for 30 minutes. So I got my chops together to do that, which I remember the first gig I did, first big gig I did was opening for Chick Corea and Miles Davis. And I was prepared to do it because I knew how to do that, play solo. And so that was a good experience. And so that Martin had put me into an ad in 1984 with Steve Howe. There's an ad with me and Steve Howe. And so I got exposure in all these magazines like Guitar Player, Circus Magazine. I mean, all these things. I mean, nobody knew what I sounded like, but they knew my name. And so we, at the same time, around 84 April, we did a recording at Warner Brothers, live to 2-track with these two guys. And they didn't release it, but we could use it for radio and promotion. And that led us to get a tour of Germany, where we played like in Berlin and Munich and all over the place for 2 or 3 weeks in the summer of 84. And I remember, I mean, we were in the newspaper and we were the little trio from California, but people came out. And that led us to go back to the States and do a very big tour of the colleges. We did probably like 50 colleges in 3 or 4 months.
Man.
In a van, driving around playing, and we had the little EP on Warner. And so that, through all that, we got that, and that ultimately led us to go into the studio again and record a full 32-track digital recording that was engineered by Chet Himes, who did the Christopher Cross records.
Yeah.
And so we did that, which became Long Peter Matson, and then MCA had a jazz department that they put together. They signed Michael Brecker, they signed Larry Carlton, they signed the Yellow Jackets, and they signed me. And so I was like, here I am in the middle of...
nice company, yeah.
I was a kid, but, we had the experience of touring. We'd already done like, tons of gigs, and the record came out and we just kept touring, and that's how things developed. So, I mean, my I tell people, you have to have a goal of what you want to do, and you have to visualize it. If you think about it every day and you imagine yourself doing it, doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow, but if you keep going towards that goal, because I could see things in my mind about, I'd like to do this, and I imagine what it felt like, and I achieved that. But when you achieve it, you have to give yourself a check mark, like that's success. Success to me is not how many records you sell or how much money you make. It's like completing something. If you're going to write a tune, write a tune. If you're going to learn a tune, learn it. If you're going to do a gig, do a gig. If you're going to do a tour, do a tour. If you're going to put a record out, put a record out. And make that the goal of the success, because everything else that comes out of it. I mean, I didn't ever imagine recording for a major label. I thought, no way. There's no way that I'm ever going to be on a major label, because they're going to tell me what to do, and I don't want to do that, and I'm very stubborn. I'll be on some boutique label, but I got a record deal with a major label at 23 years old, and it was like, wow. And they didn't tell me what to do. They just like, oh, we believe in what you're doing. So just, and that, that at that time, that was a hard thing to achieve. I mean, not many people were able to get record deals. So a lot of people kind of looked at me like, well, how did you do that? I'm like, well, I worked really hard, but I'm still working, because once I signed the contract, it wasn't like, okay, it's all going to just fall in my lap. I still had to get out there and work and learn the whole thing about how the record business works and the radio and all that. But it's interesting because I still know people. It's 40 years since we started touring this year, and it's my 20th record. And I still know people in the quote unquote music business that I dealt with 40 years ago.
Sure.
And it's great, because that doesn't change. That is still there. And so I'm very grateful at the opportunity that I've had to do that. And, I have a big catalog of music, which I'm very proud of.
Yeah.
And have gotten to work with people like Ron Carter and, whoever, and just things I never imagined. So I'm very grateful to still be doing it. And every opportunity I get to go out and play, I'm like, yeah.
So what has changed? Like, if you look back, let's say when you started 4 years, I mean, the so-called record industry, which almost doesn't exist nowadays, or what is a record or album, but like, in your view, what has changed? Well, for better or worse?
It's the internet has made things easier to reach people. Like you and I are talking, you're in Slovenia, I'm in Illinois, and that wouldn't be possible 40 years ago. We could with a bad line, it would cost us a lot of money. But the thing is that when I look back at how we started with nothing, and we created this thing we had an EP, I had an ad in magazines, and we went out and tried to get gigs. And I had a guy that was sort of our manager, booking agent, who helped me do a lot of it, but we made it work, and the thing is that regardless of what you have as tools, you still have to do the follow-up work. So even though you can go on YouTube and make videos and you can reach people that wouldn't normally see you, you still have to do the follow-up work. That hasn't changed.
Yeah.
The whole process of getting out there and making a name for yourself means you have to take risks. You have to be willing to go out. And the thing I find, which is interesting, Samo, is a lot of guys are not afraid of failure. They're afraid of success. When they get an opportunity, they kind of go like, I don't know if I can do this. And they say no, or they find a way to kind of screw it up. Like with me, I remember my manager called me and said, can you open for Miles Davis on Saturday? It was a Tuesday. I'm like, yeah. I didn't think twice about it. I went, okay. And there was like, 50,000 people in the audience and just me on the guitar. But because, if you prepare yourself and are willing to go out and do stuff, and that was the thing, the bass player that we had and my brother, we were willing to go out there and drive in a van in Germany and go play these gigs in Berlin, and then go, do like 16, 20, 30-hour drives to go do these college campuses. But we were out playing. I mean, I remember being in the middle of Iowa, playing this really cool club called the Maintenance Shop, where it was packed. It was sold out. And across town was Bruce Springsteen playing the Born in the USA tour. I guess we're doing it. I guess this is what it is, And I think that's the thing. You have to, regardless of the tools that you use, you have to get out and do the work. And that's the thing. It's easier today to think you're doing a lot by getting likes and all that stuff. But if you don't go out and follow up on that, it's not going to happen. I mean, you could do something spectacular on YouTube and maybe you have a chance to make a career for yourself. But if you look at all the people that, we know that have sustained themselves over the decades, it's not just because of the internet. They have something that keeps them going. And in my case, I meet a lot of people that I didn't knew about my earlier stuff. Like I've met so many guitar players who are maybe like 10, 15 years younger than me, who tell me that the very first jazz guitar record they bought was Long Peter Matson. And I'm like, why Wes Montgomery? And they're like, no, we bought your record. Then I discovered Wes Montgomery. I'm like, wow. And so that means a lot, that record had an impact, because I was a young guy trying to figure out what I was doing. And there were certainly a lot of other guitar players to go check out, but they bought that. And I'm like, wow, that's a great compliment. So, it's always good to reflect on where you've been and kind of look at your thing from an outsider standpoint, because it's hard to do in the middle of it.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned Attila before, Zoller, and I played with Michael Formanek like last month, and Mike played so much with Attila, and we spoke about Attila actually a lot in the van. But I wanted to ask you, what was your connection to him, and how did that project happen? I mean, what was the impetus actually to do it? So
it's an interesting story, because I met Attila in the mid-90s in Frankfurt at the Frankfurt, and he was playing for Hohner, I think, or was it Hohner, or was it? No, it was Höfner. And so I knew his name. I knew who he was. I'd never met him. I'd never seen him. And so I'm sitting at this booth, or this sound booth, and I look at, there's a guy with a guitar, and he looks sort of familiar, but I couldn't tell who he was. I didn't see his name tag. He's like, come on, let's play. And so I started to play. And immediately he heard the Joe Diorio influence. And he said, man, you know Joe? And I said, of course. And then I looked at his name and I said, of course, Attila. So we got to know each other, and he invited me to Vermont to go to school. But I was living in Belgium at the time. And so we corresponded a little bit. And then I lost touch with him, and then he got ill and passed away. And so I was very grateful that I got a chance to play with him, because that was a really cool experience. And then years later, I was living in Germany, and I had a student in Cologne, and I'm giving him a lesson one day in his apartment. In the corner is a Höfner guitar. And he goes, do you know whose guitar that is? And I said, no. And he said, it's Attila Zoller's. I'm like, how did you get Attila Zoller's guitar? Well, his girlfriend was good friends with Attila's daughter, Alicia. And her mother, the mother of my student's girlfriend, was good friends with Attila. She used to hang with him and Lee Konitz in the 50s and 60s, and go to Paris and hang, and they used to go to her apartment and play at 3 a.m. And she was an amazing lady. She was an artist and a poet. Her name was Inga. She passed away a few years ago, but she told me some great stories about Attila. So I get this email. I'm in LA in, I think it's like 2012 or something. And my student's like, hey, I'm in Boston, and I just saw Alicia, and she wants to have her dad's music recorded by all the guys that worked with him. And I said, I know the guy that could produce it. And so I thought of you, and could you do it? And I'm like, sure, I'd love to do it. I'll put the budget together, and you tell me how much you need, and we'll make it happen. I'm like, great. So the first thing I did is I started reaching out to all the guys I know that knew Attila, like John, Mike Stern, Pat Metheny, John Schofield. And then I got a copy of his phone book, which had Ron Carter's number, Gil Holland, Gary Peacock. I mean, and of course I knew Wolfgang Lackerschmidt because I played with him, with Larry Coryell. So I reached out to him and a whole bunch of people. And so the first person to call me back was Ron Carter.
Oh, wow, man.
And I was sitting in LA, my cell phone rings, and I pick it up and I said, hello. And he said, Mr. Becker, it's Ron Carter. And he said, I'd love to be involved. And I said, great. So, because I had no idea, how we were going to do this, because I knew everybody lives in different cities. So I planned to do a couple sessions in New York. And the first session was with Ron and Gene Bernicini and my brother on drums and myself. And I arranged 3 tunes for that session, where it was a quartet, it was a trio, and a duo. And Ron was great. I mean, I would send him the arrangements, and he'd send me back messages and say, I'm working on it, I'm working on this. And what a pleasure to work. I mean, and in fact, it was funny because in the studio when we got done, he said to me, because at the time, Birdland, I was talking to them, they wanted me to play because I just played there for Joe Diorio. And Ron said, if you play Birdland, he said, you call me. He said, if I'm not working, I'll play.
Beautiful.
Wow. So we've become friends through that. And I haven't seen Ron in a while, but I email with him occasionally. So that started the project. And then, of course, John did a thing with Michael, you know, and my brother. And I didn't play on that. I wanted John to do it in a trio. But actually, at the end of that song, there's a chord that's going on in the out vamp, and that's me.
Okay.
John didn't do any rhythm guitar, and there was something missing in the mix. And I just said, it just needs this one, you know, sharp 11 chords. Just picked up a guitar and did that. So, and then I did a couple sessions with Peter Bernstein, and
Yeah, beautiful.
then we did some with Mike Stern out in California, and then Wolfgang did a session with what's his name? Lalos Dudas,
Yeah, Lalos Dudas, yeah. Yep.
And they did a session that they sent me that I mixed. And then Pat Metheny sent me a message when I was in Argentina and said, man, he goes, I'm really busy, but I have an idea. He said, I can get the rights to the recording I did with Jim Hall of Birds and Bees.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I can give you that for the record. Would that be cool? And I said, yes. So I thought, great. So we got that. I just took that and remastered a little bit, you know, from that recording. So I'm glad that he was able to be a part of that.
Beautiful, yeah.
And that's how that came together. And then I told my student, I said, you know, if you want to get it released, Peter Finger, who did Attila's last recording, would put it out, you know, and he wanted to get it out on Enja Records because Matthias Winkelmann, I knew Matthias because we'd worked together, and Matthias was interested. So we met in Munich a couple times, and he put the record out. But sadly, you know, Matthias passed away and he didn't have a chance to really work it the way it should be. But it's a really great record. And I got everybody to do a little, not everybody, I got most people to do a little message. That's why it's called Message to Attila. Yeah. And the message that Ron Carter does on the opening of the record, have you heard that?
No.
That was, okay, check that out. If you don't have it, I'll send it to you. So we're finishing the last track in the studio, and I wrote a 4 bass part for this tune of Attila's called Peace Tune. So it was just drums, bass, and acoustic guitar, and Ron playing 4 basses. And at the end of the last track, Ron's still in the booth, and I said, hey, Ron, would you do me a favor and just speak a message to Attila? And he went, boom, and he just started doing this rap and playing. And it was like, we all got chills.
Oh, man, beautiful.
Amazing. So that set the standard of what it was. So
fantastic. Yeah, it's so beautiful. I mean, like today, you know, we mentioned Joe Diorio and Attila Zoller, like all these guys who are so amazing.
Yes.
Yet still so under the radar for, you know, like the current generation of students, when I teach them, like, well, they don't know who these players are, and they should, obviously. So it's like,
well,
it's good that they get exposure.
Yeah, but you know, it's funny because through the medium of social media and YouTube and all that, a lot of the guys get discovered by new generations. Exactly. I mean, I know in my case, there's a lot of people that weren't even born when I made Third Time Around that are big fans. And so I look at it this way, like there's a lot of things to be discovered. What I do find is that it's a little frustrating when you do a workshop and someone says, who is that? You go, well, just go on YouTube or Google and you'll know right away. You can find everything about this guy in a minute. I've become friends with Wes Montgomery's son, Robert, the last year. Robert did a really nice project for his father. And they're dedicating a street in the name of Wes. It's going to be this year. And I may have a chance to to Indianapolis. It's about 3 hours from here. But Robert knew nothing about his father because he just knew that he was dad, and he died when he was like 5 years old. He still remembers him like getting up in the middle of the night with his guitar, getting in the car, telling his wife, okay, I'll see you in 3 weeks, and driving off. And so for a long time, Robert didn't want to know anything about his father's music. He couldn't listen to any of it. But later on, he discovered it and became like the gatekeeper of Wes Montgomery's legacy. And so he did a documentary, which I wasn't in the documentary, but there's an extra like footage of other musicians talking about Wes, and I'm in that. And it's great because, you know, you think about a kid who is the son of Wes Montgomery, he would be absorbed by the music, but he had to relearn everything about his father. But the good thing is, his mother saved all of the contracts of Wes.
Wow.
Every gig he ever did. So they have all this stuff. It's amazing.
Amazing. Wow. Quite cool, man. Yeah.
I still believe that, that people will discover things. I mean, Joe, when he was around doing what he was doing, through his teaching and through the books that he wrote, he got a really big, fan base of guitar players and other people who knew him. And I don't think there's one country that doesn't know Joe Diorio, and Attila, the same thing. I mean, the Birds and Bees, when that record came out, that's Herbie Hancock on keyboards playing that original music. And that was one of his most popular tunes. That was his hit, so to speak. And, I think those things, they last, eternally. So it's not important whether somebody got their due when they were alive. We know that from people like Van Gogh and people like Bach and Mozart. So you just have to kind of do what you do and be true to yourself as an artist. And what I try to do is always try to connect to the music fan that I am.
Yeah.
Because that's the person I can really rely on. I'm not trying to figure out what the next craze is or what the guitar players will like. I just try to, why do I like to play music?
Yeah.
And that's what makes me, want to do something more and motivates me to keep going. And the fact that I continue to grow, that's, I can't ask for anything better. So,
Yeah. Beautiful. Man, you put it so beautifully. So I kind of want to end it here, but like I just still want to ask you a question. Like, what's still on the schedule for you for this year? And you said, there's a new record coming out in August. And do you have some touring plans or coming to Europe?
I've got several concerts with Planets. That's the main focus. I'm doing one next week in Baltimore, and then I've got a show in California on the 31st of August. I'm doing a week workshop in Italy from the 10th through the 17th in Tuscany. If anybody's interested to come, there's still space for that. And then I have another Planets concert here in Springfield on the 5th of October. And then on the 19th of October, I've got one in Taos, New Mexico. And we're working on stuff for next year. So, and Planets is a cool project because we have the visuals of the space and all this stuff. And I'm not just doing the specific planets. I'm also doing other pieces of music which relate to like the Aurora Borealis and, tunes of mine. It's an hour-and-a-half show. And I did 3 shows down in New Zealand and they were all sold out. And it's a lot of fun because it's just me, but I can create a lot of music and it's a challenge to do it every night. So I'm really looking forward to getting the album out and doing more shows. I'd love to come to Slovenia and play. If we get a chance to do more stuff, it'd be great.
Yeah.
In fact, I was there as a kid. My dad took us to Bled.
Really? Oh man, that's beautiful. Yeah.
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 So I used to go to Austria a lot, and I remember it was still Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
But it was like 1967. I remember going there.
That's early. Yeah. That's way really early. Yeah. No, if you're ever around, drop me a line. I'm half an hour south of Graz or 2 hours south of Vienna, and we have a guest room here. You can hang, we can play, whatever. So
yeah, if I had more time on the next trip, I'd take you up on it. But I'll certainly try to work that out.
Yeah,
it'd be great to sit down and play something.
Yeah, it will be nice to have some nice food and wine and jam a little or whatever. So it'll be beautiful. So,
perfect.
David, thanks so much for sharing some of these thoughts, man. I appreciated it. We finally hooked up together and.
Send you the mixes of the new record when I get
Please
them.
Please, I'll be happy to hear it. So
it's an interesting record, so I'm excited about it.
Thank you.
I'll let you know when Paul and I get something done. What we did. We don't know what we're going to do. We're just going to get in the studio and play. So
beautiful. Say hi to Paul, and I'll let you know also when this is out. I'll send you a link and everything. So
that'd be great. That'd be great. I appreciate that.
Super.
Okay.
Cool.
All right.
Thanks, man.
Okay.
Bye.